The night Josephine Grady nearly froze to death on the Colorado Trail was the same night she learned that a man's silence could speak louder than any words she had ever heard in her 24 years of living. It was the autumn of 1873, and the Oregon Trail's southern cutoffs were already wearing the first bruises of an early winter. Josephine had not planned to be on any trail at all. She had planned to be in Denver, sitting in her late aunt's parlor, sorting through the estate papers that would determine whether she had enough money to keep herself fed through the following spring. That had been the plan. Plans, however, have a particular habit of unraveling in the American West, where the land itself seems to resist anything so tidy as human intention. The wagon she had hired out of Pueblo had broken an axle on a creek crossing 2 days north of town. The driver, a heavy-set man named Garrett who smelled of tobacco and poor decisions, had taken one look at the shattered wheel and announced that he was walking back to Pueblo, and that Josephine was welcome to do the same or wait for another party to come along. He had not waited to see which option she chose. He had simply gathered his coat and his rifle and walked south, growing smaller against the sage-gray distance, until she could not see him at all. She had waited. For 3 hours she had waited beside the tilted wagon, watching the sky go from pale blue to the particular shade of pewter that meant weather was coming. There was half a biscuit in her traveling bag and one thin wool blanket she had packed for the seats in the wagon, not for sleeping on frozen ground. She had not brought her heavier coat because she had expected to arrive in Denver before the real cold settled in. She had been wrong about a great many things that week. The cold came down off the mountains like something alive, purposeful and mean, and by the time the sun was gone entirely, the temperature had dropped to a place that made her breath come out in clouds and her fingers lose their usefulness. She had pulled the thin blanket around her shoulders and pressed herself against the side of the broken wagon and told herself she was not afraid, which was a lie she told herself frequently enough that it had become almost comfortable. She heard the horse before she saw it. A single set of hoofbeats coming from the north, slow and deliberate, the sound of an animal that was tired but still working. She stood up fast, which made her dizzy, and she squinted into the near dark. The rider came into view gradually, the way figures do when light is failing. He was a tall man on a dark horse, wearing a long canvas duster that had seen considerable weather. His hat was pulled low. He had a bedroll lashed behind his saddle and saddlebags that looked full. He was leading a second horse by a rope, a sorrel mare with a pack on her back, and the pack was loaded with enough gear to suggest this was a man who had been traveling for some time and intended to keep traveling. He slowed when he saw her and the broken wagon. He did not stop immediately. He came to a gradual halt about 30 feet away, which she understood later was the way a cautious man approaches an unknown situation in the open country, giving himself time to read what he was looking at before he committed to it. She raised one hand. It seemed like the right thing to do. He walked his horse the rest of the way forward and stopped alongside the wagon. In the failing light she could make out a strong-jawed, dark eyes that were doing their own careful reading of the situation, and several days' worth of beard that had not yet decided whether it was going to become something intentional. He looked to be in his late 20s. He looked at the broken axle. He looked at her. He looked at the sky. "The axle broke," she said, because the silence was enormous. He nodded once. He looked north, then south. He looked at the sky again the way men who travel outdoors look at skies, with the particular attention of someone who knows that what is up there is about to become very relevant to what happens down here. He swung down from the horse in one practiced motion and tied both animals to the wagon wheel with practiced economy of movement. He walked around the wagon, assessed the axle, crouched and looked under the frame, stood back up. He did all of this without speaking. Josephine watched him. She was cold enough that her thoughts were coming a little slower than she liked. He went to the sorrel's pack and began unbuckling it. He pulled out a canvas tent, small but adequate. He pulled out stakes and a mallet. He set up the tent in about the time it took her to realize what he was doing, which was not very long because she was watching him with considerable attention. He was efficient in a way that suggested doing things alone for extended periods, where every motion needs to count because there is no one to compensate for wasted effort. He rolled out a bedroll inside the tent. He put his saddlebags inside. Then he went back to the sorrel's pack and stood there for a moment in a way she would come to recognize later as the way he looked when he was making a decision he had already decided on but was taking a breath before he acted on it. He pulled out a heavy wool blanket, dark green, thick enough that even in the dim light she could see the quality of it. He carried it to her. He held it out. She looked at the blanket. She looked at him. She said, "That's your only blanket." She did not phrase it as a question because it was not a question. She could see that it was his only blanket. She had watched him unpack. There had been one. He said nothing. He kept holding the blanket out. "You will freeze," she said. He said nothing. His arm did not waver. She was cold enough that her pride did not put up much of a fight. She took the blanket. He nodded once more, that same single acknowledgement she was already beginning to catalog, and he turned and went to his horses and made sure they were tied properly and rubbed down the dark one's nose, and did all the things a man does when he is settling in for the night. She stood holding the heavy wool blanket, and she looked at the tent he had set up, and she looked at this man who had given her his only warm blanket in the dark and the cold without a word, and something in her chest did a thing she was not entirely prepared for. She said, "My name is Josephine Grady, and I am from St. Louis, Missouri, and I am traveling to Denver to settle my late aunt's estate, and I am 24 years old, and I have never in my life felt so much gratitude and so much helplessness at the same time, and you are a good man, whoever you are, and I am going to remember this kindness for the rest of my life." He had turned to look at her during this speech. He had listened to all of it. When she finished, there was a pause, and then he said, in a voice that was quiet and unhurried and carried the particular resonance of someone who does not waste words, "Cornelius Crawford, get some sleep, Miss Grady." And that was how it began. The morning came in gray and cold, but without the storm that had threatened. Josephine woke in the tent, wrapped in the heavy green blanket that smelled of wood smoke and cedar and the particular clean smell of open country, and she lay for a moment in the stillness that comes just after waking, before the mind has finished assembling the situation, and she felt something she could not immediately name. Then she named it. She felt safe. She had not felt safe in a considerable number of days. She emerged from the tent to find Cornelius Crawford crouched beside a small fire he had built from sage, and what appeared to be a few dry boards he had salvaged from the broken wagon. He was holding a battered tin pot over the flames. He looked up when she came out, and she could see that he had not slept much, or that if he had slept in his duster, because he was wearing the same clothes and he had the careful, alert look of someone who had spent the night keeping himself warm through motion and attention rather than any blanket. She felt a wave of something sharp and uncomfortable move through her, the particular guilt of having taken warmth from someone who then went without it. "I should not have taken your blanket," she said. He handed her a tin cup of coffee without responding to this. She wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth move up through her palms and into her arms, and she decided that arguing with a man who gave you coffee when you were cold was perhaps not the most sensible thing. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Denver," he said. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "That is where I am going." "I know," he said. "You said so last night." She had said quite a lot last night. She recalled the speech she had delivered while standing in the cold holding his blanket, and she felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. She was not generally a woman who made speeches. She was generally a composed, measured, practical woman, which is what you had to become when your father's business failed when you were 15, and your mother got sick the following year, and you spent the next 8 years learning to solve problems with the resources available rather than the ones you wished you had. but apparently something about extreme cold and unexpected kindness from a stranger unlocked in her a more forthcoming version of herself. "Well," she said, "I suppose we are going the same direction." He looked at the broken wagon. "Your things," he said. "What needs to come?" She thought about this. There was her traveling bag, which had her important papers and a change of clothes and her mother's small hand mirror, which she had kept through everything. There was a trunk in the wagon bed with more clothes and her aunt's letters and a few books. There was not a great deal else. "The bag," she said, "and if the trunk is not too much trouble." He assessed the trunk with the same practiced economy she had noticed the night before. He tied it onto the sorrel's pack, with a competence that suggested familiarity with loading animals. He slung her traveling bag over the saddle horn of his dark horse, whose name she would learn was Jackson, named for the river, not the president, though he only told her this much later and only because she asked directly. "You can ride the sorrel," he said. "She is steady." "I can ride," Josephine said, because she felt it was important to establish this. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the structural suggestion of one. "Good," he said. They rode north through the morning. It was a strange kind of company, she thought. She had traveled before. She had come west on a steamboat to St. Joseph, and then by wagon train as far as Pueblo. And in all that traveling there had been constant noise, the noise of people thrown together by circumstance and making the best of it by talking at each other continuously. Cornelius Crawford did not talk. He rode at an easy pace and watched the country around them, and occasionally said something brief and functional, like indicating a better path around a rocky section, or noting that they should water the horses at the creek ahead. And yet the silence was not uncomfortable. It had a quality to it that she found difficult to describe. It was a silence that felt inhabited, if that made any sense, which she was not entirely sure it did. She studied him when she thought he was not looking. He had the hands of a man who worked outdoors, calloused and capable. His gear was well maintained but unpretentious, nothing showy about any of it. He rode the way some men do when riding is as natural as walking, without thinking about it, his body moving with the horse's motion rather than against it. He was watchful without being nervous. She got the impression of a man who had arranged his relationship with the world around him into something workable, not easy, not comfortable necessarily, but workable, and who was largely at peace with that arrangement. She wanted to know his story. She had always wanted to know people's stories, which was something her mother had said was her best quality and her most dangerous habit. By midday they had stopped at the creek he had mentioned and let the horses drink, and she had produced the half-biscuit from her bag and stared at it, and he had produced beef jerky and hard cheese from his saddle-bag and divided them without comment, and they ate in the silver winter light beside the sound of the water. "What takes you to Denver?" she asked. He chewed, considered. "Work," he said. "What kind of work?" He looked at her with those dark eyes that were always doing their careful reading. "Cattle," he said. "Ranching. A man there named William Teller has a spread north of the city he wants to expand." He put word out that he was looking for an experienced hand who could help him manage the expansion. I answered the word. It was, by his standards, a considerable speech. She appreciated it accordingly. "Have you ranched long?" she asked. "Since I was 16, he said. "Started in Texas, moved around, Kansas, Wyoming, sometime in New Mexico." He paused. "It suits me." She thought it probably did. The outdoor life, the animals, the wide open country. She could see how that would suit this particular man. "And you?" he said, which surprised her because he had not struck her as a man who asked questions readily. "I taught school," she said, "in St. Louis. I was a schoolteacher for 4 years." He said nothing, but she had the sense that he was listening, so she went on. "My aunt wrote to me 6 months ago and said she was not well and that she wanted to settle her affairs and that I was her only family. She died in August. The estate is not large, but there are papers to sign and things to arrange, and I thought I would do it properly. Come in person, not simply send letters." She did not say the other part, which was that she had also needed to leave St. Louis, because the schoolhouse had been given to a male teacher at the end of the previous term, which the school board explained was because the parents preferred a male authority for the older students, which was the kind of explanation that was given so often and so casually that most women simply absorbed it and moved on. She had absorbed it and moved on by deciding to go west, which was what people did in 1873 when they needed to go somewhere that felt like more room. "That was good of you," Cornelius said, "to come yourself." She looked at him. "Do you think so?" "Yes," he said simply. She turned the compliment over in her mind like a smooth stone in her palm. He was not a man who said things to fill the air, which meant that what he said carried more weight, she thought, like how silence can make music more meaningful. They made camp that second night in the lee of a rock formation that blocked the wind from the north, and she insisted on sharing the blanket, which was large enough for the purpose, and he agreed to this with the same quiet practicality with which he seemed to agree to most things. They sat on opposite sides of the small fire first, and she told him about her students in St. Louis, the ones who had made her laugh and the ones who had made her pull her patience up from somewhere deep, and he listened to all of it with the kind of attention that is rare, the kind that does not wait for you to finish so it can speak, but actually follows the thread of what you are saying and holds it. When she ran out of stories, she asked him where he had grown up. "Tennessee," he said. "Small town outside Nashville. My father had a farm." "Did you want a farm?" she asked. A longer pause than usual. The fire snapped. "No," he said. "I wanted to see what was out there." He looked west, though there was nothing to see in the dark but the suggestion of hills against stars. "I was 17 when I left. Never went back." "Do you miss it?" she asked. He thought about this for a long time, which she was learning was his habit, to give questions the actual weight they deserved rather than answering quickly just to fill space. "I miss what I thought it was," he said finally, "not what it was." She understood that completely. "Yes," she said, "I know exactly what you mean." He looked at her then in a way that was new, a fractionally more direct look than his usual watchful assessment, something slightly more open in it, and she felt her heart do something inadvisable. On the third day out, the landscape changed. The plains gave way to foothills, and the foothills began reaching toward mountains, and the sky took on that particular deep altitude blue that she had heard people describe but had not understood until she was inside it. The cold was still there, but it was a cleaner cold now, thinner, and the sun was fully out, and the light on the snow that covered the higher peaks was so bright it was almost painful. Josephine Grady felt something loosening in her chest, something she had carried tightly for a long time, the careful management of resources, the calibration of expectations, the bracing for disappointment that had become such a fixed habit that she rarely noticed she was doing it anymore. Out here, in this enormous, beautiful, indifferent landscape, beside this quiet, careful man, she felt it loosening. "It is wonderful," she said, looking at the mountains. He was watching her, she realized when she glanced over, not the mountains. He looked away quickly, and she pretended not to have noticed, which seemed like the gentlest possible response. They reached a small settlement called Cedar Fork late that afternoon, a cluster of buildings that included a general store, a livery, a small hotel of the word's most optimistic definition, and a saloon that appeared to be doing more business than everything else combined. Cornelius stopped at the livery and saw to the horses with the same careful attention he gave everything that was in his charge, and she stood in the cold street and looked at this small, rough settlement and felt the particular sensation of a traveler who has spent days moving and suddenly stopped. He came out of the livery and looked at her. "They have rooms," he said, meaning the hotel. "I spoke with the livery man. It is 30 cents. "I have money," she said immediately. "I did not suggest otherwise," he said mildly. She felt her face warm. "I know, I just wanted to say so." "All right," he said. She studied him. "You are remarkably difficult to offend." "I know," he said with that almost smile again. The hotel was run by a woman named Mrs. Hutchins, who was somewhere past 60, and had the efficient manner of someone who had survived the frontier by refusing to be surprised by anything it produced. She gave Josephine a room at the back and Cornelius a room at the front, and she set them both a supper of venison stew and corn bread that was the best thing Josephine had eaten in a week, and she ate it at a small table in the hotel's front room while Cornelius sat across from her and ate his own serving with the unhurried appreciation of a man who knows what it is to go without. Mrs. Hutchins refilled their coffee and looked at them both with frank curiosity. "You two traveling together?" she asked. "We are going the same direction," Josephine said. "That is the same thing out here," Mrs. Hutchins said, and went back to her kitchen. Cornelius caught Josephine's eye across the table, and she saw something there that she had not seen before, a glimmer of actual amusement, and she laughed, which she had not done in a while. And when she laughed he smiled, a real one, full and unguarded, and it changed his face entirely, opening something up in it that the habitual quiet kept closed, and she thought she would very much like to make him smile again. She thought about that later, in her small cold room with his heavy green blanket pulled over the hotel's thin one, because he had brought it up without a word when he showed her to her door, and she lay in the dark thinking about it with a careful honesty she usually reserved for her private accounting of practical matters. She was developing feelings for Cornelius Crawford. This was inconvenient in any number of ways. They were two strangers traveling the same direction for entirely different purposes. He had a job waiting for him in Denver, and she had an estate to settle, and after that she had no particular plan except that she suspected she was not going back to St. Louis. She did not know what he intended after Denver. She did not know if he was the kind of man who stayed anywhere for long. She knew that he was the kind of man who gave his last warm blanket to a woman he had just met in the dark and the cold without saying a word about it, which told her more about him than a month of conversation might have. She was falling for him. She might as well be honest about it. The next morning she came down to find him already at the table with coffee and a look on his face that said he had been up for a while. Mrs. Hutchins produced eggs and salt pork, and Josephine sat across from him and said, "How much farther is it to Denver?" "2 days," he said. "Maybe 3. Depends on the weather." She nodded. 2 or 3 days, and then they would arrive and he would go to his cattle work and she would go to her estate papers, and that would be the shape of things. "Cornelius," she said. He looked up. "When we reach Denver," she said, "I do not know what happens next, for me, I mean, after the estate. I have been thinking about it and I do not have a clear plan. I have been a school teacher and I am good at it, but I do not know that I want to go back east." She paused. "I am telling you this because I am not sure why, and that is somewhat unusual for me since I generally know exactly why I say things." He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment with that full, careful attention of his. Then he said, "Colorado is a territory that needs teachers." She blinked. "Yes," she said, "it does. Denver has at least 2 schools from what I know," he said, "possibly 3 by now." "Yes," she said again. He picked up his coffee cup again. "Thought you should know," he said. She stared at him. He was looking at his coffee with apparent neutrality. She felt something large and warm moving through her chest. "Thank you," she said, "for thinking about it. Just useful information," he said. "Is it?" she said. "Yes," he said, and then Mrs. Hutchins arrived with the salt pork, and the moment dissolved into practicality, which seemed to be where Cornelius Crawford preferred most moments to go. The second day out of Cedar Fork, the weather that had been threatening since they left the broken wagon finally made good on its intentions. A front came in off the mountains in the late afternoon, fast and serious, dropping the temperature and bringing snow that was not the gentle decorative kind, but the hard driving kind that comes sideways and means business. They pushed the horses into a canter for a stretch, because Cornelius had seen a homestead marked on his map about 4 miles ahead, and getting to it before full dark became the goal. The homestead was real, and it was occupied by a family named Brewer, Thomas and Clara Brewer, and their 3 children, who had come out from Ohio 2 years prior, and were in the process of discovering, as many such families were discovering in 1873, that the gap between the promise of Western land and the reality of Western land was a wide and drafty one. They were not prosperous, but they were decent, and they opened their door to the two travelers without hesitation, which was the frontier way in situations like this, because everyone out here understood that the land could be turned against you without warning, and today's shelter giver might be tomorrow's shelter seeker. Clara Brewer was a small, energetic woman with capable hands and kind eyes who produced supper from what appeared to be very little and made it seem like plenty. The children, 2 boys and a girl, ranged from about 6 to 11, and they regarded Cornelius with the frank fascination that children have for tall, quiet men, asking him questions about his horse and his guns and where he had been, and he answered each question patiently and without condescension, which Josephine watched with the particular attention she gave to how people treated those who had less power than them, which she had always believed was the truest indicator of character. Thomas Brewer asked Cornelius about the cattle trade and Colorado's prospects, and they talked over supper with the kind of earnest practical conversation that men in that era and that place had about land and animals, and the reliability of water and the price of beef in the eastern markets. Josephine talked with Clara about the children's schooling, or rather the lack of it, since the nearest schoolhouse was 30 miles away and unreachable half the year. "I would give almost anything for someone to teach them," Clara said quietly. "Tom can read well enough and so can I, but they need more than we can give them. They need real teaching." Josephine looked across the table at Cornelius, who was listening to Thomas about water rights and appeared to be not paying attention to her conversation at all. She looked at Clara's 3 children, who were eating with the uncomplicated concentration of children who have been doing hard physical things all day and are genuinely hungry. "What does your oldest want to be?" she asked Clara. Clara smiled. "Marcus wants to be a lawyer," she said, with the particular mix of pride and uncertainty of a mother who believes her child but is not sure the world will cooperate. "He is very serious about it." "Then he needs to learn," Josephine said. "Seriously." They slept by the brewer's fire that night, wrapped in their respective blankets, the children bundled in their loft. The snow hit the roof with a steady whisper. Josephine lay on her side facing the dying fire, and she could see across the room that Cornelius was on his back looking at the ceiling. She thought he was probably awake. "Cornelius," she said softly. A pause. "Yes." "Do you like children?" Another pause, but a different kind. Not the considering kind, but the kind where the question has reached somewhere deeper than expected. "Yes," he said, "I do." She did not say anything more. The fire ticked. The snow whispered. "Josephine," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I am glad the axle broke," he said. She lay very still in the dark with the warmth of that sentence moving through her. "So am I," she said. In the morning the snow had stopped and the world was white and bright, and the Brewer children were enormously excited about this and ran in it while the adults drank coffee. Cornelius and Thomas saw to the horses together, and Josephine helped Clara with the breakfast dishes, and she looked out the small window at the white landscape and the man working in it, his dark coat against the white, the way he moved with that unhurried competence, and she thought, that is the kind of man you build a life with. Then she thought, that is a significant thing to think about a person you have known for 4 days. Then she thought, yes, but I am not wrong. They left the Brewers with Thomas's thanks and Clara's pressed hand and the solemn, round-eyed watching of 3 children from the doorway, and Marcus, the oldest, the one who wanted to be a lawyer, called after them, "Will you come back this way?" Josephine turned in the saddle. She looked at the boy. She looked at Cornelius. "Maybe," she called back. Cornelius said nothing. But he looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that was too substantial for the word maybe, but too new to be named yet. Denver in November of 1873 was a city in the energetic disorder of becoming. It had been a genuine city for only a few years, incorporated in 1861, and it wore its ambitions loudly. There were brick buildings going up beside wooden ones, telegraph lines running along the main streets, newspapers, hotels, banks. There was mud on every road and optimism in every establishment, and the particular energy of a place that is not yet finished and knows it, and is not troubled by the fact. Josephine and Cornelius arrived in the afternoon of a clear, cold day, riding down Larimer Street with the Rocky Mountains framing the western sky in a way that made her breath catch even though she had been looking at them for 2 days. She had the address of the attorney handling her aunt's estate in her bag, and Cornelius had the address of William Teller's ranch office in his memory. They stopped their horses in front of the Overland Hotel, which was the first establishment of obvious quality they had passed, and they looked at each other. She had been traveling with this man for 5 days. She had slept in his tent and eaten his food and been warmed by his blanket, and told him things she had not told anyone in St. Louis where she had lived for years. And now they were in Denver and the trail was over and the logic of shared circumstance that had put them together was resolved. She did not want to get off her horse. She recognized this feeling as irrational and also entirely real. "The sorrow," she said. "I should help you return her to wherever she belongs." "She is mine," he said. "Both horses are mine," she blinked. She had assumed the sorrow was a second horse rented from Pueblo for the trip. "Oh," she said, "I did not realize." "You can ride her again," he said. "If you need to." She looked at him. He was looking at his saddle horn with the studied neutrality of a man who has said something that came out more than he intended and is not sure how to address it. "Cornelius," she said, "would you like to have supper with me this evening, after we have each attended to our respective business?" He looked up. "Yes," he said. "All right," she said. He dismounted. He helped her down from the sorrel, which she did not strictly need, but accepted because his hand on her arm for the moment it took was a kindness. He took her bag from the saddle and carried it to the hotel door and left it there. 6 o'clock, she said. 6 o'clock, he said. He rode away north toward Teller's ranch office, and she watched him go, and then she picked up her bag and went inside to get a room and wash the trail dust off and attend to the practical business of her life. The attorney was a Mr. Harold Pemberton, a careful thin man with good manners and a precise sense of what constituted his professional obligations. He walked her through the estate over 2 hours. Her aunt, a woman named Margaret Grady who had never married and had spent 40 years in Colorado, first as a settler and then as a businesswoman of modest but genuine success, had left a small house on the eastern edge of Denver, some savings, and most unexpectedly, a 1/3 interest in a general store that Margaret had helped finance some years before. The house was hers. The savings were hers. The interest in the store was hers. It was not wealth, but it was, Josephine realized as Mr. Pemberton laid it out, a foundation. More foundation than she had walked into Denver with, certainly. She sat for a moment after he finished. "Miss Grady," Mr. Pemberton said. "I am all right," she said. "I am just working out what this means." What it meant, she understood gradually, was that she did not have to go back to St. Louis. What it meant was that she had, by the particular grace of a kind, unmarried aunt who had believed in leaving things to family, a foothold in Denver, Colorado. She had a house. She had a small income from the store interest. She had enough to live on while she determined what she wanted to do next. She thought about Clara Brewer's boy, who wanted to be a lawyer and had no teacher. She walked back to the Overland Hotel in the cold blue late afternoon with her head full of numbers and possibilities, and she went to her room, and she stood at the window looking at the mountains, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that the ground under her feet had some solidity to it. At 6 o'clock she came down to the hotel dining room in her second-best dress, which was the best one she had brought, a dark blue wool that was practical and also, she knew, not unbecoming. She had done her hair properly for the first time since Pueblo. Cornelius was there before her, which she might have predicted. He had cleaned up as well, his beard trimmed close, his shirt new or at least newly pressed, his coat brushed. He stood up when she came in, which she had not expected, and which produced a small warm sensation in her sternum. He looked at her in a way that was direct and unguarded and lasted only a moment before he looked at the table, and she thought, there it is. There is what is underneath all that careful quiet. They sat down. The hotel dining room was half full with the particular mix of Denver's 1873 population, businessmen, ranchers, a few well-dressed women who ran establishments or were wives of the businessmen, a couple of working men who had dressed up for the occasion of eating in a proper room. "How was your meeting?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Teller is a straightforward man. The work is real and it is what he described. I start Monday." "And the ranch," she said, "is it what you hoped?" He considered. "It is more than I hoped for," he said. "It is a good operation, room to grow, he is building something serious." She smiled. "That sounds like it suits you." "It does," he said. "How was your meeting?" She told him about the estate. She told him about the house and the store interest and what it meant. She told him that she thought she might stay in Denver, that she thought the territory needed teachers, that there was a school here, that she had already inquired about this afternoon in the brief hour between the attorney's office and the hotel. He listened to all of it. He asked about the school, how many students, what subjects, who ran it. She told him what she knew. He nodded. "You would be good at it," he said. "I am good at it," she said. "I was always good at it. The school board in St. Louis simply failed to notice." "Their loss," he said simply, and she felt the accuracy of that simple statement land somewhere important. They ate supper. It was good food, roasted beef and potatoes and bread, simple and well prepared, and they ate it with the comfortable ease of two people who have shared enough meals to have lost the formal awkwardness of eating with a stranger. They talked about Denver and what it was becoming. They talked about the cattle trade and what the railroad was doing to it. She told him about her father's business, which had been a dry goods wholesale operation in St. Louis, and how it had failed, and he listened without the condescension or the pity that most people produced when she told this story, just simple attention, and when she finished he said, "Your father's failure was not your failure." "No," she said, "but it shaped mine." She paused. "In the good way, I mean, it made me practical." "I noticed," he said. She looked at him. "Did you?" "From the beginning," he said. "When you said I would freeze, you were right. I would have been cold, but you assessed it correctly." She laughed. "You gave me your last blanket and I told you that you would freeze. That is an unusual way to thank someone." "You were right," he said again, "and you took it. That was sensible." She shook her head slowly. "Cornelius Crawford, you are something original." He looked at his plate, but she could see that he was pleased and that it was genuine. After supper they walked outside because she wanted to see the mountains at night, and he came without being asked, which she noted. The mountains at night, with a half-moon above them, were silver and enormous and utterly indifferent to the human city at their feet, which she found consoling rather than diminishing. There is something reassuring about things that are larger than whatever trouble you are carrying. They stood on the boardwalk outside the hotel and looked west at the mountains. "I have something to say," she said. "All right," he said. She turned to face him. He turned to look at her. In the cold moonlight he looked like something important, something she should not let go of, and she was in general a woman who held on to what mattered. "I know that we have known each other for only 5 days," she said. "And I know that you are a man who says things when he means them and does not say them when he does not. And I respect that very much. And I know that you have a job starting Monday, and I have an estate to settle and a school to inquire about. And I know that all of that is true and practical and real." She paused. "I also know that I have never met anyone like you, and I would very much like, if you are willing, to continue being acquainted, to not let Denver be the end of it." He looked at her for a long moment in that way he had, where you could not see what was happening behind the quiet, but you had the sense that something significant was being arranged. "I would like that," he said. She let out a breath she had been holding. "Good," she said. "Good, Josephine," he said. "Yes. I gave you the blanket," he said, "because you were cold and I was not yet. That was the practical reason." He paused. "But I also gave it because I wanted to, because it mattered to me that you were not cold." He stopped. He looked at the mountains. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said. She felt her eyes go warm. She looked at the mountains too so that he would not see her trying to compose herself. "I know," she said. "That is one of the things I like best about you." They stood there in the cold for a while longer, side by side, looking at the silver mountains, and then they went back inside because it was genuinely very cold and that was the sensible thing to do, and Josephine Grady went asleep that night with the heavy green blanket folded at the foot of her bed, and a feeling in her chest that was warm and certain and new. November became December. Josephine settled into Denver with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been waiting a long time for a fixed point to settle from. She signed the papers on her aunt's house, a modest two-room structure on Arapahoe Street with a wood stove and a small garden that was a bare skeleton of itself in the winter, but showed the promise of what it would be in spring. She met the man who ran the general store, a gruff but fair man named Arthur Clemens who had known her aunt well, and who was relieved to discover that the new part-owner had a practical head and no intention of interfering with his running of the store, as long as it continued to run honestly. She went to the school, which was called the Denver Territorial School, a single large room on Blake Street operated by a man named Professor Haynes, who was 50 years old and excellent with the older students and deeply uninterested in the younger ones, which meant that when Josephine presented herself as an experienced teacher who specifically enjoyed the 7 to 10 age range, he shook her hand with unqualified enthusiasm and offered her a position beginning in January at a salary that was not generous but was enough. She had a house. She had an income. She had a purpose. She felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has been living provisionally and has finally landed. And she had Cornelius Crawford. He came on Sunday mornings, which was his day off from the Teller Ranch. He came with the regularity and the unpretentious reliability of sunrise, arriving at her door at 9 o'clock, and they would walk the city together, which in late 1873 was a walk through a place in furious transformation. New buildings were going up every week. The railroad terminus was bringing goods from the east at a pace that was changing what was available and what was possible. There were debates in the newspapers about Colorado statehood, which was still 3 years away but already in the air. Denver was a city in the act of deciding what it was going to be. They talked about all of it as they walked. She told him what she was reading in the newspapers, the commercial debates and the political ones, and he told her what he was seeing on the ranch, the practical economics of expanding a cattle operation, the particular challenges of the Colorado winters, the conversations among the ranch hands about land and futures. He was more talkative on Sundays than he was on any other occasion she could imagine, which she suspected was because she was the only person in his life at this point who consistently invited his observations and seemed genuinely interested in them. She introduced him to Mrs. Lottie Calloway, who ran the boarding house 3 doors down from her aunt's house and who had become a friend of the local institution type, a woman who had been in Denver since before it was Denver and who knew everyone and everything about the town and was generous with the information. Mrs. Calloway assessed Cornelius with the frank efficiency of a woman who has sized up a great many people in her time. "Steady," Mrs. Calloway pronounced afterward when Cornelius had gone back to the ranch. "That is a steady man, Miss Grady. They are rarer than gold out here." "I know," Josephine said. "Do you know that he looks at you like you hung the moon when you are not watching?" Mrs. Calloway said. Josephine felt her face change. "Does he?" "Child," Mrs. Calloway said, with the tolerant patience of vast experience. "Yes." Christmas of 1873 came, and with it the particular loneliness that holidays can produce in people who are far from their families, which for Josephine meant far from a father in St. Louis who was getting older and a few cousins she was fond of, and the graves of her mother and her aunt. She put a pine bough over the door of her aunt's house and baked a gingerbread with Mrs. Calloway's help, and attended the Christmas service at the Methodist Church on Lawrence Street. Cornelius showed up on Christmas morning, which was not Sunday but which she later understood had required him to negotiate with William Teller, who was not an unreasonable man. He brought her a book, a collection of natural history of the Western Territories, which was exactly the right thing because it was practical and interesting, and showed that he had been paying attention to what she said about her curiosity for the country she was learning to live in. She had made him a pair of gloves. She had bought the leather in November from a saddle maker's shop, and she had learned to stitch leather with Mrs. Calloway's guidance, and the result was not professional, but it was solid and warm, and he put them on immediately and flexed his hands in them with the expression of a man who is genuinely pleased. "They are not perfectly even," she said, looking at them critically. "The left thumb is slightly shorter." "They are good gloves," he said. "I will use them." "I made them," she said. "They could have been better." He looked at her. "They are made by you," he said. "That makes them the best gloves I have." She felt that statement all the way to the back of her ribs. They ate Christmas dinner at the Overland Hotel because she insisted on treating him, which he objected to and then accepted because she was firm about it in a way that he had come to recognize meant the discussion was concluded. The hotel dining room was full and decorated, and there was a fiddle player in the corner playing seasonal music with more enthusiasm than precision. And they sat across from each other and ate roasted goose, and she told him about her childhood Christmases in St. Louis when her father's business had still been going well, and the table had been full of people, and there had been real abundance. He told her about Christmas in Tennessee, his mother's cooking, the cold, clear Christmases of his boyhood before he left, and she could hear in his voice, underneath the careful neutrality, a thread of something that was not quite grief but was adjacent to it. "Do you write to them?" she asked. "Your family?" "My mother," he said. "I write twice a year," she writes back. "And your father?" A pause. "He died in '64, he said. "The war." She had not known. She felt the weight of it land. "I am sorry," she said. "He believed in what he was fighting for," Cornelius said, measured and careful. "I am not sure that makes it better." "No," she said, "but it makes it more his." He looked at her with that fully open look, the one that appeared rarely and lasted only a moment but which she had come to regard as the truest version of him. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the first time she had done something so direct, and she felt her own pulse in her palm. He turned his hand over and closed it around hers and held it, and the fiddle player played something that was trying to be a carol, and the dining room was warm and full, and Josephine Grady thought, "I am home. Not in the building. In this specific thing happening right now." January came, and with it the school term, and 42 children between the ages of 6 and 14 packed into the Blake Street schoolroom, divided between herself and Professor Haynes by age. Her 23 younger children were a boisterous and various group. There were children of miners and children of merchants and children of homesteaders who had come to the city for the winter for various reasons. And they ranged from children who had some schooling to children who had never sat still for an educational purpose in their young lives. She loved them immediately and comprehensively, which she recognized was her professional hazard, and she set about teaching them with the focused joy of someone doing exactly what they are meant to do. She told Cornelius about them on Sunday mornings as they walked, the ones who were struggling and the ones who were shooting ahead, the funny things they said and the heartbreaking things. He listened with the same attentive quality she had first noticed on the trail, and he remembered things, specific names and situations, so that the following week he would ask, "How is the one who has trouble with his letters, the boy whose father works the consolidated mine?" And she would be startled every time pleasantly by the fact that he had held on to it. "You have a remarkable memory," she told him one Sunday in February. "I remember things that matter," he said. She looked at him. "And my students matter. You tell me about them," he said. "So yes." She stopped walking. He stopped too and looked at her. "Cornelius," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said. The Colorado winter air was very cold and very still around them. A horse went by pulling a cart. The mountains were white. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not fully read because it was too full of things to read quickly. "I have been trying to find the right time to say that to you," he said, "since before Christmas." "There is no right time," she said. "There is only time." He took one step forward, and he put his hands on either side of her face carefully, like something important, and he looked at her for one more long moment, and then he kissed her, which was the most thoughtful kiss she had ever experienced in the sense that it had the quality of a man doing something he has considered seriously and decided on completely. And her hands came up and held his wrists, and the Colorado winter happened around them without their noticing. "I love you," he said against her temple. "I have loved you since you stood in the cold and the dark and told me your whole name and your age and your business and thanked me for a blanket." She laughed into the wool of his coat. "That was not my finest hour." "It was a fine hour," he said. "You said everything and I said nothing, and I knew." She pulled back enough to look at him. "You knew from that night." "I knew something happened," he said carefully. "The knowing what it was came later, but something happened." She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "Something happened." They stood there in the February street holding each other with the mountains watching from the west and the city moving around them, and she felt the remarkable and specific happiness of a woman who has found the thing she was not looking for and recognizes it completely. Spring came to Denver with the particular urgency that spring has at altitude, where winter is long and release comes suddenly, and everything that has been held back under the cold, and the snow presses forward all at once. The garden behind her aunt's house, which had been bare sticks and frozen ground, produced with startling speed. She planted the seeds she had bought from Mr. Clemens's store, vegetables mostly but also a few flowers, because she believed in flowers even in the West, especially in the West. Cornelius came on April Sundays and helped her build a cold frame from scrap lumber he brought from the ranch, working with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. And she worked beside him and they talked about the garden and about the school and about his work on the ranch, where the spring calving season was in full swing and he was working longer hours than usual. William Teller had been giving him more responsibility as the months went on, which Cornelius mentioned without either pride or false modesty, simply reporting it as a fact that was relevant to his situation. Teller was talking about making him foreman of the expanding northern operation, which would mean more pay and more authority and more work, and Cornelius was considering it with the thoroughness he brought to all decisions. "What do you think?" She asked him one April evening on her small porch where they sat in the late light with coffee, about the foreman position. He was quiet for a while. "I think it is what I have been working toward," he said. "I think Teller is a man worth working for. I think the ranch has a real future." "But," she said because there was one, he looked at her. "I would be on the North Range most of the week. There is a foreman's cabin up there. It is a good cabin, but it is not here." She held very still. "I have been thinking," he said with the particular care of a man walking on ground he is not sure is solid, "about what the right thing to ask is." She set down her coffee cup. "Cornelius Crawford," she said, "if you are working toward asking me to marry you, I would very much like you to complete that journey at your own pace, but I want you to know that the answer is yes." He stared at her. Then he made a sound that was almost a laugh, genuine and startled, and then he did laugh, and she laughed too because they were sitting on a small porch in Denver, Colorado in the spring of 1874, and the answer was yes. "I do not have a ring," he said. "Get one," she said. "I will wait." He got one. He had it made by a jeweler on Larimer Street, a plain gold band with a small turquoise set in it, which he chose because turquoise was the color of the Colorado sky, and she had said once that it was the most beautiful sky she had ever seen. When he gave it to her properly, on a Sunday evening in May on her porch with the mountains golden in the evening light, he knelt down and asked her formally, and she said yes formally, and then she put the ring on and looked at it for a long moment. "It is perfect," she said. "I thought of you when I chose it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why it is perfect." They were married in June of 1874 at the Methodist Church on Lawrence Street, a simple ceremony that was attended by Mrs. Calloway and Arthur Clemens and Professor Haynes and several families, whose children Josephine taught, and William Teller and his wife, a pleasant woman named Eleanor, who embraced Josephine warmly and said, "He has been a different man since he came down from that trail last fall. I did not know what had changed until now." The Brewer family came as well, Thomas and Clara and their 3 children, because Josephine had written to them in the spring and Clara had written back immediately, and they had made the journey into Denver for the occasion, which moved her more than she could say. Marcus Brewer, who was 11 and wanted to be a lawyer, shook Cornelius's hand at the reception with great seriousness, and Cornelius shook it back with the same seriousness, and told him to keep up with his reading. The reception was held at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, which had a large parlor that Mrs. Calloway opened without any discussion of cost, and there was music from the same fiddle player from the Overland Hotel, who was, if possible, even more enthusiastic than at Christmas. And there was food that half the women in the neighborhood had contributed to, because that was how things worked in a community. And Josephine danced with her husband in a room full of people who were genuinely glad for both of them. And she thought, this is what it is to have a place in the world. Cornelius danced. She had not expected this. He danced without grace but with total commitment, which was, she decided, exactly right. They moved to the North Range cabin in late June. It was 3 days' ride from Denver, which felt far at first, and she arranged with Professor Haynes that she would teach in Denver through the fall term and come home for the winter, which was the only practical arrangement given the distances. Cornelius arranged the same with Teller, who was a practical man. The cabin was a real cabin, not the roughshod temporary structure she had half expected. It had been built by a serious man with the intention of lasting. It had a stone fireplace and a proper wooden floor and 2 rooms, and it sat on a rise above the grazing land with the mountains in the distance in every direction, and a creek running 50 yards behind it. She stood on the step the first morning and looked at all of it and thought, I have been moving toward this exact view my whole life without knowing it. She planted a garden behind the cabin as soon as the soil was workable. She made the cabin into a home, which meant putting her mother's hand mirror on the bedroom dresser, and her books on the shelf Cornelius built for them, and her aunt's small quilt on the bed, and the turquoise ring on her hand where it had been since May. The North Range hands were 12 men at peak season, and they were initially uncertain what to make of the foreman's new wife, because a woman on a working range was unusual, and novelty makes people cautious. But she was not precious about the work or about her surroundings, and she could ride, as she had established from the first morning when she went out with Cornelius to see the range and kept pace with him without any visible difficulty. She made coffee for the hands in the mornings when they came near the cabin, good strong coffee, and she listened to their talk, and did not offer opinions where she had not been asked, and did offer them when she had something useful to say, which she was good at distinguishing. By midsummer she was, if not exactly one of them, at least someone they understood and respected, which was enough. In September she went back to Denver for the school term, and Cornelius rode her in, 3 days down, and they said goodbye at the door of her aunt's house, which was still hers, which she lived in during the school term, and it was a harder goodbye than she had anticipated. She stood on the step and he stood in the street holding Jackson's reins, and the morning light was on everything. January, he said. I will come in January. I know, she said. I will be here. He looked at her for one of those long, quiet-looking moments. Then he said, I will miss you. She felt her throat tighten. That is the most domestic thing you have ever said to me. I mean it, he said. I know you do, she said. That is why it matters. He rode north. She watched him go until the street bent and she could not see him any more. Then she turned and went in to start the season. They wrote letters. She had not known he could write with the same care he brought to everything else, but he could. His letters were not long, but they were precise. telling her specific things about the range and the animals and the weather in the mountains. And at the end of each one, there was a sentence or two that was not about practicalities, but about what he was thinking about that was not practical. And those were the sentences she read twice. She wrote to him about the children, about Denver, about what was happening in the territory. And at the end of her letters, she told him the things she would say to him if he were there with his complete attention, which she had come to regard as one of the most valuable things in her life. January came, and he came with it, riding in on a Tuesday with snow on his coat and cold in his breath, and she opened the door before he could knock because she had heard Jackson's distinctive hoofbeats on the frozen street. She stood in the doorway and he stood on the step, and they looked at each other for a long moment, and then she stepped forward and he put his arms around her, and they stood on the step in the January cold, and she thought, "This is what I was trying to explain to Clara Brewer that morning in her kitchen, this specific thing, which cannot be explained, only experienced." Spring of 1875 found them back on the North Range together, the cabin, the garden, the mountains, and in April Josephine told Cornelius she was expecting a child. He went very still. She watched his face and saw something move through it that she could not name except to say it was enormous. He took both her hands in his and held them and looked at her. "Are you well?" he said. "You are feeling all right." "I feel very well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but Mrs. Calloway says that is normal." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "A child." "Yes," she said. "Ours." He pulled her close and she felt his arms around her and his face against her hair, and he was very still, the way he went still when something was too large for his usual economy to contain. "A child," he said again, quietly to himself really, as if testing the word and finding it right. She laughed against his chest. "You are going to have to say more than one word at a time about this, Cornelius." "In a minute," he said, holding her. "Give me a minute." She gave him the minute. Their son was born in December of 1875, 2 weeks before Christmas, in the Denver house where Josephine had returned for the birth with Mrs. Calloway as her primary support, and a capable midwife named Mrs. Foster, who had delivered half of Denver's current population. Cornelius came down from the North Range the moment word reached him, riding harder than he usually allowed himself to ride. And he arrived at the Arapahoe Street house on an afternoon when the sky was clear and cold, and the mountains were perfectly visible, and his son was 6 hours old. He stood in the doorway of the small bedroom and looked at Josephine in the bed, and at the bundle she was holding, and she looked at him from across that room, and she thought she would never forget how he looked in that moment. He looked like a man seeing something he had not known to hope for. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms. He held the child with an instinctive steadiness, supporting the head the way Mrs. Foster had shown her earlier and which he seemed to know without being told. He looked at the baby for a long time. "He has your forehead," she said. "He has your mouth," he said. "What do you think his name should be?" she asked. They had discussed names but not settled. Cornelius looked at the baby. He was quiet for a moment. "James," he said, "for my father, James Cornelius Crawford." Her throat tightened. She had not expected that. "Are you sure?" "He was a good man," Cornelius said quietly. "Whatever he believed in that cost him. He was a good man, and I left before I told him so." He looked up at her. "James." "James," she said. James Cornelius Crawford entered the world in December of 1875. And his parents looked at him with the specific awe of people who have made something they do not fully understand, but recognize completely as precious. Mrs. Calloway came to the door of the bedroom and looked in at the three of them and went away without saying anything, which was, Josephine thought, the most tactful thing she had ever done. James grew. He grew with the speed and enthusiasm of a healthy child in a household that was stable and warm and full of attention. He spent his first winter in Denver with his mother and his father, who had arranged to stay through the winter for the first time since taking the foreman position, because Teller had acquired a reliable winter hand, and because Cornelius Crawford was not a man to leave his wife alone with a newborn through a Colorado winter. He was a quiet baby, which surprised some people given the enthusiasm of his mother. He watched everything with dark eyes that were his father's eyes, and he reached for things with a purposefulness that was both parents in equal measure. When he was 3 months old, he laughed for the first time at a face Cornelius made, an expression of mock surprise that Josephine had never seen on her husband before and did not know he had available. And when James laughed, Cornelius laughed too, the real laugh she had heard for the first time on Christmas night in the Overland Hotel. And she sat across the room and watched the two of them and felt something that had no name except her whole life. Summer of 1876, Colorado achieved statehood on the 1st of August, the centennial year of the nation, and Denver celebrated with a fervor that shook the windows, and James, 8 months old and sitting up now, watched the fireworks from his father's arms with enormous eyes and did not cry once, which Cornelius took as evidence of character. By 1877, with James walking and talking and asserting opinions about everything that entered his field of vision, Josephine and Cornelius had made a life that was settled in all the ways that matter without being settled in the ways that stagnate. She taught every fall and winter in Denver. She had advocated successfully, alongside Professor Haynes and several of Denver's prominent women, for a second schoolroom and an additional teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Pendleton, who was exactly the kind of serious, dedicated teacher the school needed. The store Josephine had inherited a stake and had grown, and Arthur Clemens ran it well, and she had used her portion of the proceeds to buy additional books for the school library. Cornelius had become, in the opinion of William Teller and in the general understanding of everyone who worked with him, one of the most capable ranch managers on the Colorado Front Range. He had a gift for the work that went beyond technical competence into something harder to define, an ability to see the whole of a situation and respond to it with proportionate judgment. Teller had offered him a partnership stake in the North Range operation, which they were in the process of formalizing, and which meant that, for the first time, Cornelius Crawford would own a piece of the land he worked, which was a thing he had wanted since he was 17 in Tennessee, and had understood only slowly enough that he had not known he was working toward it. He told her about the partnership stake one evening in the North Range cabin, with James asleep in the back room and the fire going and the winter mountains visible through the window as white shapes against the dark sky. Teller wants to formalize it in the spring, he said. A quarter stake in the North Range. I would take over the full management in exchange for buying in over 5 years. She looked at him. And what do you want? He looked at the fire. I want it, he said. I have wanted something like it for a long time, but it means staying. He looked at her. It means this is where we are. Cornelius, she said, where else would we be? He seemed to hear something in this that satisfied him because the set of his shoulders changed in a way she had learned to read as relief. This is where we are, she said firmly. Denver in the winters, here in the summers, your ranch, my school, James, this. This, he said. Yes, she said. This. He leaned over and kissed her in the warm light of the fire, and James, who had not actually been asleep, made a noise from the back room that suggested protest at being left out, and they both laughed. In the spring of 1878 they rode out together on a Sunday morning, she on the sorrel, who was older now but still steady, and he on Jackson, who was showing his years but was not done, and James, not quite 3, rode in front of his father on Jackson's back with Cornelius's arm steady around him. They rode out onto the North Range in the early light of a May morning, when the grass was coming back green, and the mountains had lost their winter severity, and the sky was the exact color of the turquoise in her ring. James was asking questions about everything they passed, the way children that age ask questions, in a continuous stream that requires more stamina than information, and Cornelius answered each one with complete attention, and Josephine rode alongside them, and listened to her husband explain the world to her son in his quiet, precise way, and she felt a completeness that was the rarest kind of feeling, the kind where nothing is missing, where there is no asterisk, where it is simply what it is. "Papa," James said, "where does the grass go in winter?" Cornelius considered this. "It goes under the snow," he said, "and waits. Is it sleeping?" "Something like it," Cornelius said. "And then it comes back." "Every year," Cornelius said. "Every spring, it comes back." James appeared to find this entirely satisfactory. He leaned back against his father's chest and looked at the green grass and the mountains and the sky. Josephine rode close enough to reach over and put her hand briefly on her husband's arm, and he looked at her over James's dark head, and she looked at him, and they held that look for a moment, the particular look of two people who know exactly what they have. She thought about a broken wagon in the dark, and a man she did not know coming out of the November night on a tired horse. She thought about a blanket, heavy and green, held out without a word. She thought about standing in the cold saying everything while he said nothing, and how both things had been necessary. She thought about Cedar Fork and the Brewer family and Mrs. Calloway, and the school on Blake Street and the turquoise ring and Christmas dancing, with the indifferent fiddle player and a baby who laughed at his father's face. She thought about how the life you end up in is usually not the one you planned and almost always the one you needed, if you are paying enough attention to recognize it when it comes for you. "Cornelius," she said. He looked at her, that full, dark, attentive look. "I said everything that night on the trail," she said, "when you gave me the blanket." "Do you remember?" "I remember," he said. "I meant all of it," she said. "I meant it more than I knew." He reached across the small distance between their horses and took her hand, gloved now in the leather gloves she had made him that first Christmas, worn and soft with use. He held it the way he had held it on the Christmas table in the Overland Hotel, with the same complete and certain grip. "I know," he said. They rode on through the spring morning, the three of them, with the mountains on every side and the green grass and the blue sky and the creek sparkling in the distance, and the cattle grazing on the rise ahead, and all of it belonging to them in the way that things belong to you, not through ownership but through presence, through showing up and staying and loving what is there. James fell asleep against his father's chest before they reached the north pasture. Cornelius held him easily, adjusting the arm around him without breaking his horse's stride. "He is going to be tall," Josephine said, looking at her son. "He is going to be curious," Cornelius said. "That will serve him better." "I wonder what he will want to be," she said. "Something with questions," Cornelius said. "He has a great many of them," she laughed. "He gets that from me." "Yes," he said with that almost smile. "He does." They turned back toward the cabin in the mid-morning, the mountains getting sharper and brighter as the light grew. There was smoke from the chimney, which meant the morning fire was still going, and there were wildflowers coming up along the creek bank, blue and yellow, small and hardy, and entirely suited to where they had chosen to grow. She thought of Clara Brewer, who had written in February to say that Marcus had been accepted to read law in Denver with an established firm, which meant that somewhere in this story there was a thread she had pulled that had helped the boy who wanted to be a lawyer become the man who would be one. She would write back this week. She would tell Clara that she was glad. She would mean it. She thought of her Aunt Margaret, who had loved this territory and left it to her. Not just the house and the money, but the belonging to it, the permission to think of it as hers. She thought of her students on Blake Street, the 23 faces that would be different faces in September but would need the same things, the patient attention and the firm encouragement, and the conviction that what they were learning mattered for who they were going to become. She thought of her father in St. Louis, who was older now and wrote her letters that were shorter and warmer than his letters used to be, who had said in his last letter that he was glad she had found her footing. She had written back and said that she was too. She thought of the trail, the particular Colorado Trail in November of 1873, and a night so cold it had a quality of permanence, and a man who came out of the dark on a tired horse and set up a tent and then handed her his last warm blanket without a single word. She had said everything. He had said nothing. And somewhere in that exchange, in that particular combination of his silence and her everything, the whole thing had started. The whole life. This one. Here. With the mountains and the spring grass and the boy asleep on his father's chest, and the turquoise ring and the sorrel mare steady under her, and the cabin on the rise with smoke coming from the chimney. She would take this over any life she had planned. She would take this over anything. Back at the cabin she dismounted and Cornelius passed James down to her and the boy stirred and blinked and said without preamble, "Are there fish in the creek?" "Yes," she said. "I want to catch one," he said. "After lunch," she said. "Papa can teach me," James said. She looked up at Cornelius, who was dismounting. He caught her look and she saw what was in his eyes, the same warmth that had been building in him since the morning James was born, the particular love of a man who had spent most of his life alone and could not quite believe in what he had now and so kept a small portion of his attention on it at all times, the way you keep an eye on something precious to make sure it is still there. "Yes," Cornelius said to his son. "I will teach you." James accepted this with full satisfaction, and wriggled to be put down, and immediately went to look at the creek from a safe distance, which Cornelius watched with a portion of his attention without appearing to. Josephine came to stand beside her husband, and they both watched their son regarding the creek with intense strategic consideration. "He is going to be in that creek before lunch," Cornelius said. "Without question," she said. "I will get dry clothes ready," he said. "Already done," she said. He looked at her sideways, the almost smile. "You are always going to be good at this," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said. "You are not a man who needs teaching," she said. "You are a man who needs room." He was quiet for a moment. "You gave me that," he said. "You give me that." "You give it back," she said. "You always have." They stood in the May sunlight in front of their cabin on their land with their son at the creek below, and the mountains all around. And Josephine Grady Crawford, who had once stood in the cold and the dark with a thin blanket and nothing settled, looked at her life and found it full beyond anything she had known to want. And Cornelius Crawford, who had ridden out of the November night and given his last warm blanket to a woman he did not know and said nothing at all while she said everything, stood beside his wife and his son and his mountains, and understood, in the deep and particular way of a man who does not waste words on things that are obvious, that this was what he had been riding toward since he was 17 years old and left Tennessee to see what was out there. What was out there was this. It always had been. That summer they received a letter from Cornelius's mother in Tennessee, the first one that had included a suggestion that she might like to visit, which was an enormous thing from a woman who had not left her county in 30 years. Josephine wrote back immediately and with warmth, extending the invitation with specificity, the best time to come, the route from Nashville, what she could expect. She sealed the letter and handed it to Cornelius to review, and he read it and looked at her. "You did not need to do that," he said. "Yes, I did," she said. "She is James's grandmother. She should know him." He handed the letter back without a word, but his hand rested on hers for a moment longer than the exchange required. His mother came in the fall of 1878, a small, determined woman named Helen Crawford, who had the same watchful dark eyes and who took in Denver, and the ranch and her grandson and her daughter-in-law, with the systematic attention of someone making sure her son had made a good accounting of himself. By the third day of her visit, she had given Josephine her recipe for apple cake and had taught James to play a simple card game and had said to Cornelius, in Josephine's hearing and apparently with the intention of being heard, "She is exactly right for you. You should thank God every day." Cornelius, who was splitting wood at the time, said nothing, but he split the next log with considerably more energy than was strictly necessary, which Josephine recognized as the physical expression of a man who is very pleased. By 1879, the North Range operation was formally in partnership, a quarter stake for Cornelius, properly papered through a Denver law office. He had worked 5 years for it, and he wore the ownership the way he wore everything, without display, but with the quiet authority of someone who knows what they have earned. Josephine received word in the spring of 1879 that the school on Blake Street was to be expanded into 2 separate rooms on a proper schedule, and that the school board was inviting her to serve as head of the primary school, which meant she would manage the younger children's curriculum and supervise Miss Pendleton and any additional teachers hired. She accepted. She told Cornelius over supper at the North Range cabin one evening, and he listened, and then he said, "Head of the school." "Head of the primary school," she corrected. "Professor Haynes still runs the upper." "Still," he said. "Still," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Your aunt would have been proud." She felt the truth of that settle in her chest. "Yes," she said, "she would have." "So am I," he said. She set down her fork. "Cornelius Crawford," she said, "you are getting better at saying things." He looked at her with those dark eyes. "I had good incentive," he said. She reached across the table, and he took her hand, and they sat in the lamplight of their cabin with the mountains dark outside the window and their son asleep in the back room and the fire going and everything, for this particular evening, entirely and exactly as it should be. On the last Sunday of October 1879, Josephine and Cornelius rode up to the highest point of the North Range that the horses could comfortably reach, which they did sometimes on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed, and James stayed with the ranch cook who adored him. They sat their horses at the top of the rise with the whole of the range visible below and the mountains beyond, and the autumn light going golden across everything. She had something to tell him. She had been deciding on the right moment, and this was it, this particular Sunday afternoon with the golden light and the mountains. "Cornelius," she said. He looked at her. "Ready." "James is going to have a brother or a sister," she said. "By spring." He held very still. Then the same thing moved through his face that had moved through it the first time, the enormous thing, and he reached over and took her hand the way he always did, with that certain grip. "Spring," he said. "April," she said. "Mrs. Foster thinks April." He nodded. He held her hand and looked at the mountains for a moment, then he looked at her. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I feel wonderful, actually." He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to his lips, which was a gesture he almost never made, which made it mean more when he did. She felt it everywhere. "April," he said again. "Yes," she said. "Another Crawford." He smiled, the real one, full and unhurried. "Good," he said. The baby came in April as Mrs. Foster had predicted, a daughter this time, born with Cornelius present as he had insisted on being, and she came into the world with considerable announcement, the exact opposite of her brother's quiet arrival. She was loud and certain, and her father held her with the same steady assurance he had held James, and looked at her with the same enormous look. "She sounds like her mother," he said. "That is not a complaint," Josephine said. "No," he said. "It is absolutely not." They named her Margaret Helen, after Josephine's aunt and Cornelius's mother, and the 2 older women, who had by this point exchanged several letters and regarded each other with mutual respect, were both deeply satisfied with this decision. Margaret Helen Crawford grew up knowing her own mind from the beginning, which did not surprise anyone who knew either of her parents. James was 5 when she was born, and regarded her with the serious proprietary attention of an older sibling who has decided the newcomer is worth protecting. He taught her things with great authority as she grew, some of which were accurate and some of which were creative, and she accepted or rejected his teachings based on her own assessment, which was sharp. By 1882, with James 6 and Margaret 2, the Crawford family was a settled and recognizable feature of both Denver's school community and the North Range cattle operation. Josephine had 4 teachers working under her at the primary school now, and the curriculum she had developed over the years was being discussed in the state's educational press as a model for Western Territory schools. Cornelius had expanded the North Range herd by 30% over 5 years, and Teller had given him a second-quarter stake in recognition of what the operation had become under his management. The cabin on the North Range had been expanded with a proper second room and a covered porch from which the mountains were visible in 3 directions. They had built something. They had built it deliberately and carefully and together, and it was real. On the evening of their 8th wedding anniversary, June of 1882, they sat on the covered porch of the cabin with the children inside. James reading by the lamp with the industriousness of a boy who has been told he may stay up an extra hour if he reads, and Margaret asleep with the absolute conviction of a 2-year-old, and the summer mountains blue in the last light. Josephine was holding her coffee cup and looking at the mountains and thinking about the evening 8 years before when they had stood in front of the Overland Hotel looking at those same mountains, and she had taken a breath and said what she needed to say. "Do you remember," she said, "what you told me on the trail? When we were camped after the brewer's house, you said you were glad the axle broke." "I remember," he said. "I have been glad about it every single day since," she said. He was quiet for a moment, that particular quality of quiet that she knew by now was not absence but its opposite. Then he said, "I have been glad about it every single day since I rode away from that broken wagon and then could not stop thinking about you." She turned to look at him. "You could not stop thinking about me." "No," he said. "I thought about you all the way to Teller's office. I thought about whether you would have enough money for the hotel. I thought about your speech in the cold." She felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "You never told me that." "I am telling you now," he said. 8 years later," she said. "I said what needed saying when it needed saying," he said. "That is always the right time." She shook her head slowly and she was smiling. "Cornelius Crawford. Josephine Crawford," he said with the same inflection. She set down her coffee and moved her chair closer to his, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together on the porch of their home, with the mountains going dark against the summer sky, and the sound of their children inside the cabin, one turning pages and one breathing in the complete confidence of the very young, and the creek at the back of the property running clear and cold over its stones, and the cattle on the slopes below settling for the night, and all of it solid and real and theirs. She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt his arm tighten around her, and she closed her eyes for a moment and took stock, the way she did sometimes, of everything that had come from a broken wagon axle and a cold November night, and a man who had no words for what he felt but had one warm blanket and the absolute simple knowledge of how to use it. She had come west to settle an estate. She had settled a life. A whole, full, real life with this quiet, precise man, who showed his love in the things he did rather than the things he said, who held his children with the same careful steadiness with which he held everything that mattered, who had given her the mountains and the turquoise sky, and a partnership that was not just of property but of everything, of each other. The stars came out one by one over the Colorado mountains, and they sat there under them, the way they had sat beside a fire on the trail long ago, and the comfortable inhabited silence was between them again, but it was different now, richer, more populated with history, and with the knowledge of each other that only time makes possible. She did not need to say everything anymore. She had said it all over 8 years in pieces, in the way you say things to the person you are building a life with, incrementally, honestly, fully. And he had said his things in his way, fewer and slower but never less true. Between the one who said everything and the one who said nothing, they had made a complete language. They had made a life that spoke for itself. And on this June night in 1882, in Colorado, on the land they had earned, beside the man she loved with the full and certain love of someone who has never been wrong about the most important thing, Josephine Grady Crawford listened to the creek and the mountains and the breathing of her children and felt, as she felt every day in some form, the particular and irreducible grace of being exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the person she was supposed to be with. The night was full and quiet and real, and it was theirs.